All right, to the task at hand in Ezekiel. As you read through the 48 chapters of Ezekiel, certainly a number of themes emerge as you read through the book. And because it is at the beginning and the end, there is no way that we can miss the fact that obviously a very important theme within the book is the glory of Yahweh. And in chapter 1, and as you go through chapter 1, as Ezekiel looks and sees this great vision, and right away in verse 4, in its midst something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire, with figures resembling four living beings. He will continue to use these words of analogy as you go through this vision that he is directed by the Spirit of God to write down. And yet he leaves us in no doubt in verse 28 what this vision is all about. Such was the appearance of the likeness. There it is again. All right, this is a likeness of the glory of the Lord. The glory of Yahweh. Now, we might put it this way, Ezekiel didn't see, if I can put it this way, the pure glory of Yahweh at this point. He sees a likeness, the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. That as you read through chapter 1, okay, here are the images, here are the appearance, the likeness, that in the end is a reflection of the glory of Yahweh. And glory has the idea behind it of that which is weighty, that which gives the individual a standing that is unique in comparison to others. It is certainly the outward expression of the inward reality of the greatness of Yahweh. This is his glory. And as this day that begins with Ezekiel seeing this appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, then he hears the voice speaking from the midst of this tremendous representation and communicates to Ezekiel. And then in verses 12 to 15 of chapter 3, as it comes to an end, the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard a great rumbling sound behind me. Blessed be the glory of the Lord in his place. And then he is brought back, and in verse 15, sits 7 days, once he's back among the exiles where they were living, causing consternation among them. Then it came about, in verse 16, at the end of the 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me. And at the end of of chapter 3 and verse 23, all right, as he's appointed the watchman, he leaves the exiles. He says, so I got up and went out to the plain, and behold, the glory of the Lord was standing there, like the glory which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. Exactly what he had done when he saw the original vision of Yahweh. And then once again, the Spirit communicates to him as he is seeing the glory of the Lord. Now as he goes back to the exiles, what he is to do. And I was going to say what he was to say, and basically when you're to say it. And it was basically, you don't talk except when you are speaking to the exiles, because God has opened up your mouth to give them a message. And it's very, very interesting that you come to chapter 4 and 5, as we'll see. You get into these actions that Ezekiel does, which becomes foundational to him then speaking the word of the Lord to the exiles. And there is no new statement of dating. But this seems to be 7 days later. July 31st, the original vision is we put in the notes, and then this is into the first week of August, and Ezekiel then gives these signs and gives these messages as he returns to the exiles. Now, whether he gives it in the same day, certainly it flows out of what he has chronologically said as far as these two visions of Yahweh is concerned. But you can't read the first 3 chapters without seeing this emphasis upon the glory of Yahweh. And Ezekiel being very, very conscious of the one who has called him into prophetic ministry. And after giving his initial actions and words to the exiles, then he is taken in vision approximately a year later, after that initial 2 visions, in vision to Jerusalem. And in chapters 8 to 11, he will see the glory of the Lord depart from the temple in Jerusalem. And he makes it clear in 8:4, behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the appearance I saw in the plain. As God takes him by vision into the temple, and he sees the glory of Yahweh within the temple. The glory of the Lord that had come into the temple. 1 Kings chapter 8, when it had been consecrated, dedicated by Solomon. And the presence of the Lord, that is what we refer to as the Shekinah, the cloud of glory that was over the mercy seat. And it's interesting that Ezekiel says the glory of God that was in the temple was the glory of God that he saw in Babylon. Now reflect on that just for a second. Because Israel viewed the temple as the place where they rightfully came into the presence of Yahweh. Yahweh's presence was there, as it had been in the tabernacle. Remember in Leviticus. By the way, Leviticus is a very, very important book to remember as you go through Ezekiel. And particularly in the latter chapters, we're going to be talking about Leviticus vis-a-vis what is seen in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 46. But remember how the glory of the Lord came above the mercy seat, and while Israel was in the wilderness, they were aware. They could look to the tabernacle, they could look to the Holy of Holies, and they could even see the cloud by day above and became the pillar of fire at night. That at least while they were in the wilderness, they were conscious of the visible presence of Yahweh in their midst, and knew as they came to the tabernacle, they were coming into the presence of Yahweh. Remember what we discussed in Leviticus. Now Ezekiel is saying, all right, that same glory, that same presence that was in the temple was the presence of Yahweh that came and he saw in Babylon. And of course, what this is communicating is that the presence of the Lord is no longer restricted to one place. That God can display his glory under his sovereign initiative whenever and wherever he pleases. And so here is the appearance of the glory of the God of Israel, like the appearance which I saw in the plain. And you got the verses there. We'll come back and see how the glory departs from the temple. And as we as we come to the end of chapter 11. It's interesting how he speaks about the glory of the Lord. Verse 23, went up from the midst of the city, stood over the mountain which is to the east of the city. And then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God to the exiles in Chaldea. So the vision that I had seen left me. Then I told the exiles all the things Yahweh had shown me. And very interestingly, the glory departs from Jerusalem, but the glory has been seen in Babylon. So the implication is very, very clear that even though Judah is going to be cast into exile, the temple, the city are going to be destroyed. Nevertheless, the godly remnant can still be assured that Yahweh is with them wherever they go. He is not a God who is localized in one place. Now, it's very interesting that in chapter 11, verse 23, the place where we leave the glory of the Lord is over the mountain which is east of the city. And then all of a sudden, nothing else is stated about the glory of the Lord until you come to chapter 39. And in chapter 39, Yahweh speaks about the fact that with the restoration of Israel and with the final collapse of the enemies of God, verse 21, I shall set my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see my judgments which I have executed in my hand, which I have laid on them. And the house of Israel will know that I am Yahweh their God from that day onward. And so he sees to the very end of the age where both first the nations but also Israel will be aware once again of the glory of the Lord. And then when you come to his vision of the new temple. And it's very, very interesting in chapter 43, 1 and 2. Now remember in chapter 11, where did we leave the glory of the Lord? Over the mountain to the east of the city. In 43, 1 and 2, then he led me to the gate facing toward the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. And tying back to chapters 1 and 3 and 8, verse 3, and it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. 8 to 11. And the visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. What Ezekiel is saying is the glory of God is going to come from the east and come to the temple and again take his residence there. At the end of the days is the same glory he saw depart, chapter 11, and the same glory he saw in Babylon, chapters 1 and 3. I mean, how could Ezekiel, under the direction of the Spirit of God, make it any clearer? I mean, this is the same glory. So you better learn Ezekiel chapter 1, because we're going to be in the millennium as well. And this is the glory, this is the representation, the appearance of the glory that is going to return to the temple. In verse 4, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. The glory that departed in chapter 11 is the glory that is once again going to fill the house of Yahweh in the future. And so we can almost say that a title over Ezekiel's book is From Glory to Glory. From the glory that was in the past in the temple to anticipating in the future when the glory of the Lord is going to return once again to the temple. Now I understand, and when you come to the New Testament, a number of scholars have referred to the Apostle John as the New Testament theologian of Ezekiel. And certainly as you get into the imagery of the book of Revelation, many times we think how important it is to know Daniel. Well, can I put it this way? It's just as important to know Ezekiel as Daniel as you read the book of Revelation. In fact, many scholars would say it's even more important to know Ezekiel than Daniel. I wouldn't quite go that far. I think Beale has made a pretty good case for the fact that probably the most important section of the Old Testament as you come to Revelation, and the greater amount for how long it is within the Old Testament of allusions goes back to Daniel, but in sheer volume, because Ezekiel is a longer book. John also refers much in Revelation, but even in his gospel, what does he speak about in John chapter 1? When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, what was beheld by the believers while he's here upon the earth? And we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father. And John can certainly speak about that glory because it's not in his gospel. But in the other three Gospels, we see that he is one of the three that was taken on the Mount of Transfiguration and saw Jesus transfigured before their eyes with the glory then displayed that will be seen when he returns in the future. But there is a sense in which, as John says, that, okay, the glory that departs, the glory that will return, at least for a moment within human history, was also seen incarnate in Jesus. That we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and in truth. And yet Ezekiel, and we'll come back to that, that's why some want to see chapters 40 to 46 as being symbolic of what is taking place in the present age. That the temple is really Jesus, who is the new temple, and the glory that returns, as Ezekiel speaks about it, is really the glory that came when Jesus came, and we now live past tense to what Ezekiel is speaking about. And of course we're going to talk about the fact that no, that is not the symbolic fulfillment of what is in Ezekiel. We're going to argue for a literal fulfillment that will take place after the restoration of Israel, the defeat of the Gentiles, when God establishes his righteous rule upon the earth. And then his glory will come and fill a literal house, a literal temple within Jerusalem. But we'll put that off till next Friday when we get a chance to discuss what is in these latter chapters of Ezekiel. But no one doubts. I mean, we can speak about literality versus symbolism in the latter chapters of Ezekiel. But no one doubts, no commentator, no evangelical Orthodox commentator doubts that overarching, to use the term enveloping that has become very popular, that Ezekiel begins and it ends with the glory of Yahweh. The first vision, a vision of glory. The last vision, a vision of the return of the glory of Yahweh. And so certainly overarching the book is this great theme. And though all of the all of the prophets emphasize these three characteristics of Yahweh. Exegetes have certainly said in Isaiah there is a particular emphasis upon Yahweh's holiness. In Jeremiah, there's a particular emphasis upon his sovereignty. He is in charge of what is taking place in the nations. As you remember from Jeremiah 1. And certainly now in Ezekiel, the overarching thrust as we think in terms of God is his glory. His uniqueness that is revealed so that he has a weightiness. He has a standing that no one else within the universe has. So Isaiah, particular emphasis upon his holiness. Jeremiah, particular emphasis upon his sovereignty. And Ezekiel, a particular emphasis upon his glory. You cannot read through Ezekiel, second of all, 73 times in 48 chapters, Ezekiel uses this clause, they will know that I am Yahweh. I mean, as you read through, this kind of came like a hammer again and again. They will know that I am Yahweh. And of course, a part of that is in the call, and they'll also know that I, as Yahweh, have put a prophet among them. But they will know that I am Yahweh. And I've just listed the verses for you there. We won't look at them at this point. But it's interesting, three things are stated in relationship to the knowledge of Yahweh. First, that Israel is going to know that I am Yahweh through his judgments. And I've listed the verses for you there, beginning in chapter 5. That as judgment comes, they will know that I am Yahweh. Thus my anger will be spent, I will satisfy my wrath on them, and I shall be appeased, and they will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken in my zeal when I have spent my wrath upon them. Okay, Ezekiel, that's why you're giving them the message. When it comes to pass, they will know who has done this. They will know that I am Yahweh. And then the hints are given in chapter 7 and 20 and 29, but really comes predominantly through in chapters 34 to 39. In the future, Israel is going to come to know that who Yahweh is. They will know that I am Yahweh when he brings restoration. In fact, Yahweh makes it very, very clear to Israel. I'm not restoring you because you're worthy of restoration. I am doing this for the honor of my name, that you and the nations will know that I am Yahweh. Now, isn't that humbling? You just happen to be the seed of Abraham with whom I have a promise that I'm going to fulfill. So for the honor of my name and that all may know that I am Yahweh, I am going to do these things. I'm not going to do it because you're worthy. Again, that goes back to the Torah. I didn't choose you because you were mighty and numerous. I chose you because I had a promise with the patriarchs, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what God says at the beginning, he now says to Israel in anticipation of what he's going to do at the end. And so Israel is going to know Yahweh through his restoration. And also the nations through God's hand. As God deals with Israel, as God deals with the nations, they too, as you can see from these verses, are also going to come to know who Yahweh is. It is interesting. Again, we'll get to this in chapters 38 and 39. But as he speaks about Gog from the land of Magog, and as he speaks about Gog, notice in verse 4 of chapter 38, I will turn you about and put hooks in your jaws, and I will bring you out and all your army, horses, horsemen. Who literally, the image here is, Goma, I'm going to hook you and drag you, draw you into Israel so that I can do what? Wipe you out on the mountains of Israel. Well, why is Yahweh doing this? Why is he so involved? Well, 38:16. I shall bring you against my land in order that the nations may know me when I shall be sanctified through you before their eyes, O Gog. Gog, when the nations see what I do to you, they're going to know who I am. Gog is, if I might put it this way, the last Pharaoh. All right. Pharaoh, who is Yahweh? Well, all right. A few months later, Pharaoh knows who Yahweh is. All right, Gog, I'm going to use you to declare the nations. We saw that in Exodus, that he had literally established Pharaoh and did what he did to Pharaoh so the nations would know who Yahweh was. And to the very end, as this all comes to an end, as God sets his glory among the nations and establishes Israel. Verse 23, in the nations of chapter 39, the nations will know that the house of Israel went into exile for their iniquity, because they acted treacherously against me, and I hid my face from them. So I gave them in the hands of their adversaries, and all of them fell by the sword. According to all their uncleanness, according to their transgressions, I dealt with them, and I hid my face from them. All that took place in the past, that God now overcomes in his restoration of Israel, is to show to the nations, again, who Yahweh is. They will understand and appreciate, and so will Israel itself. They will, says Ezekiel, know at the end why God has done all that he has done, to make himself known. Now, the particular word when Yahweh comes to Ezekiel is Son of Man. 93 times Ezekiel is referred to as Son of Man. And with a Semitic understanding, son of has the idea one who is characterized as. I think Block in his commentary, as he translates, usually says human being. Human being, stand on your feet. Now you got to realize we have just seen the glory of God. And Ezekiel falls on his face and hears a voice. And the voice says, human beings, stand up. What a contrast between the grandeur, glory of God and the man that God is going to use. And so as you go through the book, you can see how Ezekiel understands and appreciates as Yahweh speaks to him his position before Yahweh. Last time, chapter 47, he's going to get the vision of the land in the future. 47:6, he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? And then he brought me back to the bank of the river. And then he will go ahead and write again the vision that God has given to him. So from beginning to end, As Yahweh comes to Ezekiel, he refers to him as Son of Man. A human being, human man. Humankind speak these words. Then, fourth theme. This is very, very important. Now, you've got to realize that Ezekiel is speaking to the exiles. He is taken by Yahweh, allowed to go in 597 BC with Jehoiachin. He goes to Chebar, where basically the exiles from Judea are placed. But the term, when he refers to the exiles, that he uses is house of, not Judah, but house of Israel. He speaks to the exiles, and he speaks about what God will do in the future as being for the house of Israel. Now, at that point, he's not just saying the exiles are made up of the 10 northern tribes, and that in the future, God's just going to restore the northern tribes and not Judah and Jerusalem. What he is showing is that in exile, the distinction between the two is no longer an issue. That it is all of the house of Israel who finds themselves in exile, in captivity. Beginning in chapter 3, verse 1. Son of man, go speak to the house of Israel. Go to the house of Israel, verse 4, and speak my words to them. And it is significant that only 5 times does he refer to the house of Judah. He does that in the enigmatic action that he takes in chapter 4 of lying on his side. 390 days, verse 5, for the house of Israel, and 40 days in verse 6 for the house of Judah. And we'll speak about the fact that no one really knows in the end what exactly Ezekiel is speaking about at that point. And some believe, even here, that even though it's house of Israel, house of Judah, that's what was in the past, but that these two together now symbolize and speak for the whole house of Israel, all the Israelites, either past or into the future. And you go through and you recognize that Ezekiel's message to the exiles is for the house of Israel. That with the exile there is no further distinction between the two peoples, the two nations. They are viewed as one. Certainly in Ezekiel, fifth of all, we see an emphasis upon the temple. We can put it this way: the temple that was and the temple that will be. The temple that housed the glory of Yahweh in the past, and the temple which will be the specific location of a revelation of the glory, the same glory of Yahweh in the future. So the temple will come before us. And Ezekiel also speaks of Yahweh's Spirit. In fact, in chapter 2, he will speak in verse 2 about the Spirit entered me and set me upon my feet. The Spirit lifted me up. The Spirit lifted me up and took me away. 3:14. And 3:24. The Spirit entered me and made me stand on my feet. And he spoke with me and said to me, go shut yourself up in your house. That's within the glory of Yahweh. He sees the Spirit, and particularly speaks of the Spirit of Yahweh entering him and moving him. And so we see an emphasis upon the Spirit of Yahweh and his involvement in Ezekiel's ministry. Well, I give you the purpose statement there, and then we'll come back and talk about the structure and also the books I've added for bibliography. But just to kind of sum up before we take our break, what is the purpose of Ezekiel? Well, Ezekiel is going to concentrate upon the fact that the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem was coming. In fact, the first half of the book will lead up to that event. In fact, chapter 24 will begin with the final siege of Jerusalem, a siege which will culminate in its destruction. And in chapter 33, Ezekiel will hear word a number of months after the destruction when the messenger comes to tell him what God has done, and then the night before his tongue is loose to start to speak concerning the restoration. But Ezekiel makes it very, very clear that the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple were necessary measures for the God of glory to employ to correct his disobedient people. And he will emphasize the disobedience of the people that leads Yahweh, leads God to discipline them, to judge them in this way through destruction and exile. However, even though that was in the present, as Ezekiel was giving his oracles to the people, and as the book was then written by Ezekiel in the direction of the Spirit of God, the exiles could look back and see, all right, that is why God has done this. Because of our sin, our rebellion against him. And yet, that is not God's final word. We should have already gotten this from the other prophets now. That is not Yahweh's final word. Yahweh's final word is that in the future he will restore a repentant remnant of his people to the land and will establish with them a new temple. That will include, once again, his personal presence among them. So that what Israel experienced in the past, in the first temple, is only a prelude to an even greater experience of Yahweh that they will have in the future. But between the past and the future is God's judgment through destruction of the temple and exile. A necessary measure, a necessary means that Yahweh uses to deal with his people and prepare them for what he will do in the future. So, as Ezekiel writes, look to the past. Now, presently, you're experiencing the results of God's judging work, and yet he also points to the future of when God will bring restoration. Well, after Isaiah and Jeremiah, I think you got the basic pattern. You failed in the past, you experienced God's present judgment, and yet this will not remain forever. At the end of days, in the future, God is going to bring restoration. And this is Ezekiel. If you haven't got it in Isaiah, if you haven't got it in Jeremiah, okay, let me tell you again a little differently. Just a little different historical background now. A prophet in Babylon speaking to the exiles who were in Babylon historically just before the temple was destroyed. Ezekiel speaking to them of what God was doing and why he was doing it. And then the event occurs. The temple is destroyed. And that looses Ezekiel's tongue to speak about what God will do in the future. But even, and certainly in books we realize that Isaiah, Jeremiah are given for Israel in this period of experiencing God's judgment before the restoration takes place. Very definitely with the historical background of Ezekiel, we picked that up. Because that's where his ministry was as he gave the messages originally, and then as they're written down, they are written down for an exilic audience, those who have experienced God's judgment and yet should anticipate and hope what Yahweh will do in the future. All right, the structure of Ezekiel. And I have to say, after Isaiah and Jeremiah, now, as I said, I've said this a number of times, with what is in Ezekiel, there are some things hard to understand. But the structure isn't. I mean, at least with Ezekiel, it is very, very clear where the divisions are, except for one major interpretive issue where I leave, I think, every one I've ever read as far as Ezekiel is concerned. And that is when we take a look, and this is in the charts you downloaded, there is no problem with seeing after the introduction a threefold division of Ezekiel. That is fairly classically followed. The only ones who would dispute this are those who would take just a twofold division of the oracles of Ezekiel. They would begin in chapter 25 as Ezekiel starts to give his oracles against the nations. And it is brought up, as it begins the oracles against the nations. The nations are judged, anticipating what then is seen in the restoration oracles, so that Israel might be restored. I mean, what God has to do to restore Israel is judge the nations. So that is all part of, and the restoration oracles really begin in chapter 25. That's a minority position. Most would say, no, we go to the messages concerning Israel's judgments, and therefore the destruction of Jerusalem, that then leads into the middle section, the middle division, that deals with the judgment of the nations, and then we come to the oracles of restoration. And you can see that I would follow a basic threefold division as far as the book is concerned. Now, it is very interesting that in the first three verses, we have a unique introduction, a unique prologue to the book of Ezekiel. Because verse 1 is given in the first person. In fact, it is the first use of a stereotype statement. It came about in such and such a year, in such and such a month. That we can see this, for instance, we'll just take the next two. In chapter 8, verse 1, and it came about in the 6th year, on the 5th day of the 6th month. And then when we come over to chapter 20, it came about in the 7th year, in the 5th month, on the 10th of the month. And in those future cases that something happened to me. Someone came to me. The Word of God came to me. And so Ezekiel begins in chapter 1, verse 1 with a stereotype introduction using the first person. While I was by the river Chebar among the exiles the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. And of course, beginning in verse 4, we've already seen, he will start to speak about the visions of God that he sees. The one that he sees on that day, and then the one in chapter 3 that is seen 7 days later. I saw visions of God. And then as he begins to speak about the vision in verse 4, and I looked. We'll revert back to the first person. But here it is. It came about in the 30th year on the 5th day of the 4th month. And it is very interesting in light of every other place where Ezekiel speaks. This takes place in the 30th year. When you come over to chapter 8, it happened in the 6th year. And we've already talked about this is an idiomatic statement. We read this. I mean, all right, from then on, everything is going to follow progression. Where's the 30th year come from? The 30th year of what? Because we can realize from verses 2 and 3, now we revert back to the third person. On the 5th of the month, in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile. All right, so whatever this 30th year is, it's the 5th year. And then the 6th year, etc. All right, so that Ezekiel goes into exile with Jehoiachin, and throughout the rest of his book, he uses the year of Jehoiachin's exile as his basic dating, except for 1:1. And then we have this third person statement. The 30th year is really the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile. And it was then, verse 3, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel. And now we find out Ezekiel, who was a priest. Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi. We have no other knowledge of who Buzi is from the Old Testament, other than he's Ezekiel's father, in the land of the Chaldeans. Now, Ezekiel being a priest helps us to appreciate the 30th year. Now, is this literal or symbolic? Because it's very interesting, priests entered, according to Numbers 4, their priestly ministry in what year? Their 30th year was their age. Now, some think this is, symbolic. The 30th year is saying, and this is when I began my priestly, prophetic ministry. Although there's a sense in which, because he's in Babylon, he's not and will not do any priestly functions. Priest mediating between the people and God, coming into God's presence for the people. But it's very, very interesting that right away, even though he will never be a priest in Jerusalem, he sees the glory of God that is revealed in Jerusalem. And I would take it that the 30th year at this point is literal. In other words, at the time when Ezekiel, if he was in Jerusalem, would have begun his priestly ministry coming into the presence of Yahweh, in a sovereign fashion in Babylon, Yahweh comes to him. Now, because he's in Babylon, he cannot fulfill any kind of priestly ministry. He can't offer up the offerings from Israel. He's 1,000 miles away from the temple, the long way around. And yet, God is going to use him as a priest prophet. That is, his prophetic ministry is going to display the glory of God to the exiles. So I think the best way to take 30th year is literally, this is his 30th year. It's not symbolic of this is when he begins his ministry, although this is when he begins his ministry in the 30th year. And he is a priest. And so, as the New American Standard does, you kind of put parentheses around verses 2 and 3, that as Ezekiel gets ready to, and that's why in verse 1 you have the first person, because this is the way he's going to give to us his prophetic messages throughout the book. One thing about Ezekiel, always know where you are chronologically, because he tells you, this is what came to me, this is what came about, this is when the Lord spoke to me in the year and month, and will give that information. But because this is going to be a whole book, it's not just the introduction of the first vision, but the introduction to Ezekiel's ministry in the third person like the other prophets. We have a clear indication of the place and the time and the fact that Ezekiel will become a prophet who receives visions from Yahweh, and the very first vision is going to be his call in to prophetic ministry. Well then, beginning in verse 4, obviously, he looks and he starts to relate to us this first vision. What he sees in 593 BC, with then what comes a week later, on August 6th, and as you go into chapters 4 and 5, he then will, and 6 and 7, he will then speak about, obviously, what he began to do, and with that day, even on the laying of his side, which significantly, with 430 days, goes into and beyond September 17th, 592, approximately a year and a month and a half. And so on the dating of Israel with a 360-year day, basically what you have from 593 BC to 592 BC is right around 405, 6, 7 days. So that when you get to chapter 8, on what he's told us in chapter 4, he's about ready to, well, he's already moved from one side to the other, but he hasn't completed that time period. But that helps, because there's a great discussion upon whether Ezekiel physically left Babylon in chapter 8, even though he says he was taken up by the Spirit in visions. Well, obviously in chapter 4, we've already seen, his body is still lying on his left side. In where? Babylon. I mean, it's kind of hard to, be a object lesson to the people lying on your side. If all of a sudden, poof, you're gone. Then you come back. Well, he can lie on his side and still be taken in vision to see what's taking place in Babylon. In Jerusalem. But those in Babylon still see him what? Lying on his side. And he's kind of checking in and out of reality anyway. This is your... these people are already starting to think that, Ezekiel is he really all there? So he tells us in chapter 8, verse 1, he was sitting in his house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, which gets the idea that it's during portions of the days he lays on his side, that the hand of the Lord fell upon him and took him in vision to see what was taking place in Jerusalem. And when he returns, as we saw at the end of chapter 11, that is when the vision, when he has seen the vision, he tells the exiles exactly what he has seen. And of course, that probably did not encourage the exiles a whole lot, because they're hearing words that they're going to be going back to Jerusalem, and Ezekiel's telling them the spirits of the glory of God has already departed from the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple is going to be destroyed. Well, certainly beginning in 1:4. And as I said, most will take it through the end of chapter 24. And maybe I should as well. However, Ezekiel is so structured. As far as this came about then. And it's significant that chapter 24 gives us a further statement. The word of the Lord came to me in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th of the month, saying, And we do not see another indication of this stereotype statement until chapter 26. Yet to a man, exegetes say, there is a major division between chapter 24 and chapter 25. And yet Ezekiel doesn't put his statements, which helps us to appreciate that this is taking place. At chapter 23, a very definite conclusion where Ezekiel has spoken about the rebellion of the house of Israel that will lead to the departure of the glory of Yahweh and the ultimate destruction of the temple. And speaking about the sin of Jerusalem, the sin of Judea, that in that present generation was only a reflection of the sins of the people throughout their history, culminating within that generation. So God brings his judgment. And chapter 23 brings us right to the brink of the fact of recognizing, okay, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. The land is going to become a desolation. Then significantly in chapter 24, 24:2, this very day, the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem. Why is this day important? Because now the siege that is going to culminate in the destruction of the temple and the city has begun. And Ezekiel gives his a statement concerning the boiling pots. He puts water on the stove, and with the siege beginning, this is it. Like the boiling water from a pot, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And as it's destroyed, Ezekiel, you cannot grieve. And it's very interesting, he brings up now, your wife is going to die, and when she does, you cannot show any grief for her. Because you are to picture my response to Jerusalem. They are receiving the judgment due them. And as it were, I look away. I do not express grief at this time. The grief has already been expressed through the prophets, as we've seen in Jeremiah and now in Ezekiel. And even though there are within the oracles against the nations, this is where we say Ezekiel has a little bit of hopscotch. His mouth is going to be loosed when we come to chapter 33. Realizing chapter 24 begins, okay, the siege has taken place. Now the siege is going to ultimately mean Jerusalem's destruction. Significant when you come to 33:21, it came about in the 12th year of our exile on the 5th of the 10th month that the refugees from Jerusalem came to me saying, the city has been taken. And the hand of the Lord had been upon me in the evening before the refugees came, that is the night before, the evening before. And he opened my mouth at that time. They came in the morning, so my mouth was open. I began, and I was no longer speechless. I now begin to speak. And the significant thing is from chapter 24:1 on through chapter 33, verse 20, Ezekiel has no longer spoken about what is taking place specifically now in Jerusalem until the completion of the seed, and he receives the word that Jerusalem has been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed. And then in 33:21, after these oracles on the judgment of the nations, that begins and ends with the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. Ezekiel then brings forth words of the restoration of the house of Israel, which we've already seen, includes in chapter 43:4 the return of the glory of Yahweh to his house.
So in 21:33, the siege will be destroyed or the siege will be ending?
No, in chapter 24, verse 2, the siege begins. Okay, Ezekiel it's revealed to him in Babylon that the siege, the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by the army of Babylon has begun. A siege which will culminate. In other words, now the army is just going to wait them out. And in fact, that siege will go, as you can see, from January of 588 BC all the way to August of 586 BC. It's basically a 2.5-year siege that takes place. And basically what the Babylonians did is they just, weigh it out. Remember that Jerusalem is behind walls. It has this water supply, so they're going to wait until the food supply runs out. They're just basically going to starve them into submission. Then when they no longer have food, they are weakened. All right, then they ram the wall and go in and take the city. So the Babylonians now control. There's no way in and out. The Judeans, the Jerusalemites cannot leave the city for those 2.5 years. And this will prepare us for when we get to Lamentations. The fact, and even Ezekiel, will speak about this: of fathers consuming sons and sons consuming fathers, which at that point might not have been figurative, because Jeremiah will bring up that during the time of siege, the food supply got so low that the Judeans reverted to cannibalism.
So 33 and 21, it doesn't matter the end of the destruction.
Chapter
33, 21.
33:21 is the report that the city has been destroyed. In other words, it happened months before. But remember, he's in Babylon. All right, now God doesn't, by vision or by revelation, say to Ezekiel in August, okay, the Babylonians have invaded the city and the destruction has taken place. It's not until, as you can see in chapter 33, until January 9th. All right, now we're 5 months later, from August to January, that now the information comes to Ezekiel that the siege is completed in the destruction of the city. Okay, there you got it. All right, and again, remember the chart we gave to you. You can look this up. We're at 588, and then in 586 is when we have the destruction of Jerusalem, and then in 585 is when Ezekiel receives word of Jerusalem's destruction. So it's about 5 months later, after the destruction has been completed. No email, right. He had to wait for the refugees to come with word. Not even any carrier pigeons at that point either. But yeah, no email. All right, so this, and again, except for where I have divided, at 24 rather than 25, as you get into most of the works, this is where this basic threefold structure is seen by commentators on Ezekiel. All right, with that, talking about commentators, let's come back and talk about some commentators that you should be aware of on the book of Ezekiel. And as you can see, I've added two. Not that these are the last word, but fortunately some some newer works are coming out on Ezekiel. The work to have on Ezekiel, the work, is the exegetical commentary by Daniel Block. This is 1,500 pages. When he was with us a few years ago, he said he had written another 1,500 pages that the publishers edited down to make it into the 2 volumes we now have. It was Dr. Barrick who said, is there any way we can get the copy of the other 1,500 pages? So it is just a monstrous work. Dr. Block spent about 15 years writing this exegetical commentary on the book. And it is the most significant work, like the NICs. I'll tell you again, you can read the text as English readers, and then in footnotes, much of the exegetical material is found. So learn how to read the NICOTs, and that's why I classify them as exegetical. It is far, far superior to the Word Biblical Commentary, 2-volume set, also on Ezekiel by Allen. I mean, if I'm in the bookstore and you say, I just have enough money to buy 2 volumes on Ezekiel, what should they be? Daniel Block will be the recommendation. I do that because yesterday in the bookstore, Jim was asking me that. So, not on Ezekiel, on another book. English interpretation. You should be very aware of the classic commentary by Feinberg. I'll talk a little bit more about Feinberg when we get to the Minor Prophets. And still in print. I think someone's picked it up on a reprint. The original was done by Moody. But it is not in depth. Feinberg will kind of give you the flow of the book, chapter by chapter. It's good to have. Along with the new work by Leroy Cooper, or Elk, I forget, it might not be Leroy Cooper, but it's in the NIC volume. Like Feinberg, at times is a little thin, but does give, like Feinberg, choice comments here and there on possible application of Ezekiel. But since you already have Block, you can be a little thin on English interpretation as you move into some other works. But they're both good works on giving you the flow of the book. Feinberg and then Cooper dealing with some of the exegetical issues. And Cooper is more of a compend. I would say this, that, and he doesn't refer that much to Block as his commentary was in writing, basically, as Block was producing his commentaries. But some of the more classic, both liberal and conservative commentaries, Cooper will make reference to copiously within the footnotes, so that basically what it becomes is a nice compend of what previous commentators have said about the book on interpretive issues. And then he has some, as I said, some salient applicational comments as far as preaching Ezekiel is concerned. So, though those are both good commentaries, but realize, all right, I did say both of them are somewhat thin. You heard that. They're not, they're good additional aids to the work by Block. And then expositionally, a new work that has just come out by a professor down at Westminster Escondido, I believe it is, Ian Duguid, in the NIVAC. And since I recommended an amillennial exposition on Jeremiah, I might as well do the same for you on Ezekiel, because dispensationalists haven't done enough on this yet, on the expositional level. But this work is the strongest work that has come out in this series on the prophets. I think even is superior to the work by Oswald on Isaiah. And he will certainly give a good understanding of Ezekiel historically, historical grammatical exegesis. And when he comes to basic principles that are being given by Ezekiel that have application both then and to the people of God within the present generation, I can live with that as well. Obviously, when he gets to contemporary application, the church is going to be the new Israel, and we are basically the fulfillment spiritually of what is seen in Ezekiel. I probably can't, as you can appreciate, go that far. But he certainly does give a good foundational interpretation and at least a good challenge on principally where you can go as far as thinking through how to apply Ezekiel into a contemporary situation. Certainly his spiritual principles, which he enunciates from the text, are very, very good. He did his doctoral work in Ezekiel, and even though he's a younger Old Testament writer at this point, it is well worth having, and at least the volumes are not overly priced, fortunately, in that series, the NIVAC. So for about, I think at our bookstore, for around $20 to $21 for a hardback is not a bad resource to have on your shelf. So I think I've already said I don't unreservedly recommend the NAVAC any more than I unreservedly, with every last volume, recommend the NAC. But the works on Ezekiel in those two series are well worth having on your shelf. And the reason is because there isn't a whole lot more out there. Now here's a point where I again have to go back. One of the outstanding expositions on English interpretation on Ezekiel is in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, the work by Ralph Alexander. In fact, you can pray. I'm not sure he said an unreserved yes at this point. Maybe he has. But I believe Dr. Alexander is going to be with us for a Winthrop in about 2 years on the possibility of going through Ezekiel. And you want to put that on your calendar when you hear about it, because he certainly has given a very, very good premillennial work on Ezekiel. And that's in the Expositor's Bible Commentary. That's what is right here. That's what EBC is. That's by Ralph Alexander, and that is one of the finest works on Ezekiel that is presently available. So as I give you these commentaries, remember Alexander. That after block, I would say before any of what I put as 2 and 3, the second work you should consult is Alexander in Expositor's Bible Commentary. That's my second choice as far as a commentary on Ezekiel is concerned. And if you're just starting with Ezekiel and don't want to get in all the minutiae the block gets into exegetically, start off with Alexander. Alexander is the best place to start on your reading as far as Ezekiel is concerned.